Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Che Rao. I'm the director of communications at the School of Public Affairs at American University. Thank you for joining us today for Protests in Cuba, What's Happening Now and Where Are They Headed? With Professor William LeoGrande, who is a professor of government at SPA. I'll let his screen come up. Thank you. Hi, Professor LeoGrande. How are you?
Very good, thanks.
Professor LeoGrande is a professor of government at SPA, is the co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, and a noted expert on Cuban politics and Cuban-American relations over the last 50 years since the Castro regime has come to power. So we thought of no one better to join us today to talk a little bit about what's happening in Cuba right now and sort of explain what's the current situation in Cuba to the SPA community. Thanks again, Professor LeoGrande, for joining us. And let me get us started right away with the first question I have. Just can you give us a quick overview? What is happening and what should we be looking at right now?
So a week ago Sunday, a protest that initially started in a poor suburb of Havana sparked major anti-government demonstrations and riots in more than a dozen cities as word spread across the island on social media. The government was able to restore order after a few hours, but the protests were really unprecedented in size and scope. Nothing like it has happened in Cuba since a riot in 1994 on the Havana waterfront, which also happened at a time when the Cuban economy was really in difficult shape. Back then, it was reeling from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loss of Soviet aid.
So, and as a reminder to people watching us on Facebook, please leave your comments or questions in the comment section of the live stream. We'll try to get to them in the last 10 minutes of the conversation. But Professor, if you can give us a sort of an overview too, what was the trigger this time? I mean, these protests have grown across the country, and they're the most significant in the last 30 plus years. What's been the trigger this time?
Well, the main trigger is people's economic desperation. Cuba's gross domestic product fell by 11% last year, and it's still falling. There are shortages of all basic goods, but most especially food and medicine and fuel. There are electrical blackouts rolling across the country, and life is just extremely, extremely difficult for people right now. The Cuban economy has a number of longstanding structural weaknesses. The two most important: low productivity and a dependence on imports. Cuba imports 70% of its food, 59% of its fuel, and most of its medical supplies. And over the last 2 years, 3 external shocks have cut off all the main sources of the country's foreign exchange currency that it needs to handle imports. So imports have fallen by 30 or 40%. And those shocks were as follows. First, the collapse in Venezuela caused a 50% drop in the shipments of cheap oil to Cuba. So Cuba now has to buy more oil on the world market. President Trump imposed a number of severe economic sanctions on the island. He cut off most U.S. travel. He pressured governments in Latin America to break their medical service contracts and kick out Cuban doctors who were earning about $500 million a year for the country. And then, most importantly, Trump closed off the main channel for Cuban Americans to send remittances to family members. That cost about $3.5 billion a year. The third shock was COVID, which closed Cuba's tourism industry, which is the main sector of that domestic economy. And that cost the country about $3.3 billion a year. And on top of that, there's been a surge in COVID in the country just in the last couple of months after it appeared that they had the disease under control. So I think people are very frustrated and disappointed that the government hasn't been able to manage the pandemic. And then finally, the ordinary workers are suffering serious inflation, which started back in January and has been eroding their real wages. So the result of that, of course, is that people are angry and frustrated. They blame the government because the government manages the economy. But the problem is the government can't do much about it because they're broke. They don't have the money to import these basic necessities that people need. And so as a consequence of that, social tensions are on the rise. We've seen small demonstrations across the island in various neighborhoods over the past year or so, but they've always been restricted, limited to just one neighborhood, quickly brought under control, and they didn't have the kind of spread that we saw a week ago Sunday. So that's when this social frustration really exploded. We, of course, have to understand that one of the main reasons for this has been the spread of social media. Cuba for years had a very low rate of internet access, but nowadays they've expanded it significantly, and most people do have internet access. And young people in Cuba, like young people everywhere, are really avid users of social media. And so that's been something that has allowed Cubans, particularly young Cubans, to create virtual social networks, which are really outside the government's ability to control them. That in turn has made people more outspoken and less afraid to voice their opposition. And of course, as we've seen in lots of places in the world, sometimes these virtual communities that have been built online can be mobilized for real world action. And that's what happened a week ago Sunday.
So how much of that is the fact that the Castros themselves, Fidel and then Raul, are no longer on the scene, and is there a general feeling that they are not as nervous to organize, or the state apparatus is not as able to quash the organization? How is it different now that they're not? Is there a difference now that they're no longer totally in control of the government?
Well, it is a difference, but the change politically is actually broader than just the Castro brothers being gone. This economic crisis is hitting Cuba just as the top leadership of the government and the party was undergoing a generational transition from the so-called historic generation that made the revolution in 1959 and founded the revolutionary government. Those people, of course, are all now in their 70s and 80s or even older. And they've gradually been turning over power to a younger generation born after 1959. The culmination of that transition actually happened just last April, when Raul Castro himself stepped down, retired as the leader of the Cuban Communist Party, and all the other remaining members of that founding generation also retired at the same time. Now, that generation had some prestige and legitimacy because they overthrew the Batista dictatorship. They were, in a sense, the founding fathers and mothers of the current Cuban system. To be sure, the popular support for the government has declined over the years, but there's still a significant portion of the population, particularly those who lived through those earlier years, who maintain support for the system. But the new generation of leaders doesn't have that kind of built-in legitimacy. They've got to demonstrate their right to govern, their legitimacy on how they perform. And of course, we know from a number of opinion polls that have been taken independently in Cuba, the most important issue for people is the economy. And right now, these new leaders are having a really tough time performing on the economy.
And how much of that has to do with other issues happening around the South America and the Caribbean? I know that Venezuela was a major trading partner for a while. Everything seems to be interdependent. How much of that what kind of havoc has that wreaked on the Cuban economy?
Well, the Venezuelan situation has been the most serious for the Cuban economy. At its peak about a decade ago, Cuba received over 100,000 barrels of oil per day from Venezuela at very, very cheap prices. And the Cubans paid for that oil with the services of Cuban doctors. At the peak, there were about 40,000 Cuban medical personnel, mostly doctors, serving in Venezuela in poor neighborhoods, and in effect, providing services to Hugo Chavez's political base. But as we know, over the last decade, the Venezuelan economy has really gone into collapse. It has not kept up its oil production. And as a result of that, it doesn't have the oil to send to Cuba to meet those medical services contracts. So today, the Cubans only get about 50 or 55,000 barrels of oil per day from Venezuela, which is not enough to meet their needs. And so as a result of that, instead of getting oil without having to pay any hard currency cost, now they've got to go into the world market and spend foreign exchange on it.
So, again, to the folks watching our live stream, please leave your questions in the comments box, and we'll try to get to them today. We get our first question from the audience, Professor LeoGrande, which sort of ties into one of my questions to you, which is, while this is all happening, obviously, we're watching from the United States. What kind of challenge does that pose to the United States in terms of stability in the Caribbean? What should be the U.S. response? What should be President Biden's response right now?
Well, after these protests happened a week ago Sunday, President Biden spoke out in support of the demonstrators, in solidarity with them, and defended the issue of human rights and urged the Cuban government to respond without violence against the demonstrators. But the Biden administration hasn't actually done anything on Cuba. During the presidential campaign, Joe Biden promised that he would reverse the Trump sanctions that were hurting Cuban families, and that particularly meant remittances and the right to travel. But he hasn't done those things yet. Right now, the policy is under review. It's been under review now for about 7 months. And I think a lot of people are suspicious that the administration really does not want to touch the Cuba issue because of how sensitive it is in domestic American politics. We know that the Cuban American community, particularly in South Florida, has very strong emotional feelings about the issue of Cuba, and that's no surprise. Over the last decade or so, the Democrats have been gaining ground among moderate Cuban Americans. But in the last election, the Democrats took a real beating in South Florida. They lost 2 House seats that they thought were safe, and Biden only carried Miami-Dade County by single digits, whereas Hillary had carried it in 2016 by over 20%. And so the Democrats feel burned by the Cuban American community on the one hand, but also by the general issue of Cuba. And so I think the Biden administration's instinct was to put this issue on the back burner while they dealt with a variety of obviously more urgent and pressing issues like restoring faith in NATO, dealing with China, dealing with Russia, and so on. But now the escalating crisis, not just in Cuba, but really across Latin America, is pushing these issues to the top of Biden's agenda. It really is not possible anymore to do nothing, because in the current circumstance, doing nothing is doing something. That is to say, it's leaving the crisis to just fester and become more severe. There's a variety of things that President Biden could do, but I think most importantly, he can just do what he said he would do during the campaign, and that would go a long way toward easing the humanitarian crisis in Cuba today. So, for example, if he reopened the channel for Cuban Americans to send support to their families through remittances, that would make daily life much easier for a majority of the Cuban people, because 56% of Cuban families were receiving remittances before Donald Trump cut them off. If he restored travel, that would, I know right now with COVID surging on the island, there's not going to be very much travel. But when the pandemic subsides, allowing a restoration of travel will make a big difference to the Cuban private sector, which is concentrated mainly in the hospitality area. So that means providing rental rooms on Airbnb to American travelers, opening private restaurants, and providing tour guides, and so on and so on and so on. The Cuban private sector was really flourishing before the pandemic. Right now, it's on its knees, and it really needs assistance in order to be able to recover. And finally, I would say the other thing that the president could do is to restaff the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. Embassy right now is operating on a skeletal staff because of what I'm sure a number of listeners will remember were the injuries, the so-called Havana syndrome, the injuries suffered by U.S. diplomats back in 2016 and 2017. So the Trump administration pulled most diplomats out of Havana. And as a result of that, we closed the consular section of the embassy to Cubans, which made it impossible for Cubans to come in and seek immigrant visas. We were normally giving 20,000 immigrant visas to Cubans every year to come to the United States. That's something that we agreed to back in 1994 to end the last migration crisis. So right now, there is no easy way for a Cuban who wants to emigrate to the United States. There is no safe and legal way for them to do that. The result is that the pressure for another migration crisis is really building. And we could head that off if we just restaffed the embassy. It's clear now that those injuries back in 2016 and 17 were not the doing of the Cuban government. We know that because now they've happened in a number of places. They've happened in China. They've happened in Russia. Just recently, we've heard that they've happened in Austria. Mm-hmm. And there were even a handful of cases right here in Washington, D.C.
So that the issue, there was a question that we got from the audience that you touched on, which is a little bit about Cuba's response to COVID. There's a high infection rate of COVID in Cuba. It has obviously impacted the tourism sector and private industry, or whatever fledgling private industry there is. But how much has Cuba's response to COVID affected the rise of these protests and discontent?
Well, initially Cuba did a really good job of controlling COVID. Now it's an island, so it had that advantage. It closed off all travel, and so it isolated itself. And it also, because it has a healthcare system that's built around the idea of prevention, it had the capacity to do testing, and it had the capacity to do really robust contact tracing. And when anybody tested positive, they had a very tough quarantine policy. You were required to be in quarantine for 2 weeks. And so Cuba had one of the lowest infection rates and one of the lowest death rates of anywhere in Latin America. The problem is that a couple of months ago, things seemed to be under control. And so they tentatively began to reopen the island to try to get the tourist sector up and running again to earn some money. And the Delta variant got in there, and it is now in community spread. And the Cubans are suffering more infections and more hospitalizations and deaths at a record level than they have previously. And their healthcare system, because of the government's poverty, because it doesn't have the resources to import protective devices or ventilators or syringes for vaccine, the healthcare system is really buckling under the strain of that, and everybody in Cuba can see it.
So given that, and the protests are continuing and voices there's an international sort of coverage of this, what are Cubans to do to advance their demands? This is a question we're getting from the audience. I mean, given that they're working outside of the government and that there really is an anti-government protest, what can they do? Are there avenues for them to advance demands?
So the government's response to the protests, apart from sending out the police to break them up on Sunday. So the government's initial response, of course, was to send out the police in order to control the protests. When President Miguel Diaz-Cartel went on television on Sunday, he was very combative. He called on regime supporters to go into the streets and fight for control of the streets. And I think a lot of commentators, myself included, felt like he was deaf to this cry for help from ordinary Cubans. Interestingly, in subsequent televised speeches to the population, he's been more conciliatory. The government, and recognizing the pain that people are suffering, recognizing some of the mistakes the government has made in managing economic affairs, and promising to make some changes on that front, that might go a ways toward easing people's suffering. The fundamental problem the government has at this point is that it does not have the resources to be able to provide adequate food and medicine for people. And there's just not a way around that unless they can begin to get significant humanitarian assistance from abroad. And that's one of the reasons that I feel really strongly that Cuban Americans ought to be able to send support to their families. Let Cuban Americans decide whether or not they want to do that, whether they don't want to do it because the government will eventually get a hold of that money, or whether they want to do it in order to ease the suffering of their families. That's not something the United States government should be deciding for them. I think Cuban Americans should have the right to make that decision. What Cubans can do on the ground, I think, is try to respond in a positive way to what appears to be the government's willingness now to engage in a bit more of a dialogue with the general public. The problem they've got, of course, is that independent voluntary associations are not allowed in Cuba. So they don't have good organized vehicles in order to engage with the government. There are opposition groups, of course. There are a number of opposition groups. They're technically illegal, and they tend to be subject to serious harassment by the police in an ongoing basis. And in fact, my guess is the government, in the aftermath of these demonstrations, is going to be even less tolerant of them than it has been up till now.
So then, given the combative sort of stance that you talked about for the current government, as this continues to play out, and it's hard to forecast into the future, but this maybe is our last question as we wrap up this event, but where do you see this heading? Is this sort of, we talk about Cuba's patron for a while, Venezuela has also kind of gone down this path of an almost dysfunctional government at this point. While there are different dynamics at play, is this a similar path that Cuba could be heading down? And then if not, what would be the difference?
No, I don't think it is. President Biden the other day called Cuba a failed state, and he's really just misusing the terminology. When we social scientists talk about a failed state, we mean a place like Haiti, where the functioning apparatus of government has literally collapsed, and it's a kind of a free-for-all of all against all. It's sort of the kind of state of nature that Hobbes talked about. Cuba's nothing like that. Cuba has actually a very strong government, a very strong bureaucracy. What's failed is the economy. And that's what they've got to focus on to get it going again. What's likely to happen going forward, I think we have to watch and see how the government responds to this over the longer term as opposed to the short term, whether or not the demonstrations a week ago were simply a one-off, that is to say, an outburst of anger and social unrest and political unrest that won't repeat. Or does it become, as we've seen in a lot of countries, a kind of rising cycle of demonstrations over time, drawing in more and more people and posing a real challenge to the government's ability to manage the country? That's something we really can't predict, because it depends on how the government responds. It depends on how the Cuban people respond to what's happened. And it depends, as I say, on the state of the Cuban economy. If the economy can begin to get going again and make life a little easier for people, I think that social tension will diminish, and the likelihood of another major social outbreak will diminish with it.
Okay. Well, we are coming to the close of the half hour that we set aside for this conversation. I want to thank Professor LeoGrande again for joining us and giving us his insight on the current events in Cuba. Please, follow along on our social media channels on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and as we post information about what's going on, anytime Professor LeoGrande is quoted in any publication, we'll be sure to share it with our community. And again, follow along for subsequent SPA Lives on subjects as they come up. But again, Professor LeoGrande, thank you so much for your time. It was really an informative discussion, and thank you for educating the SPA community.
Well, and thanks for everybody who's tuned in.